if you've been tired lately, feeling just, or for a long period of time, you just don't have any energy, you may have chronic fatigue syndrome. And there's been lots of things written up in the press about it, and Dr. Anderson has recently published a paper, and we want to discuss some of his findings because they're really, they're very hopeful. And that's, that's what I want you all to know, is that you have alternatives and that there are some very hopeful things going on. So I'm glad to have you back again.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, Hilda.
Good, good. Well, tell us, what is chronic fatigue syndrome and how does that relate to the Epstein-Barr virus? What are the symptoms?
Okay. Well, the first thing that I want to preface my remarks by saying that my own personal views about the Epstein-Barr virus and about chronic fatigue syndrome or Epstein-Barr viral syndrome are very optimistic. That when we read a lot of what's written in the media by People magazine and many of the other articles that are out now, we hear these alarming stories about very productive people just in the prime of their life who are incapacitated by this virus. And
who are getting slowly better, like centimeter by centimeter per year or something.
That's right, and many of them are just really unable to work and really carry out the normal routines of their lives. And the experience that we have had is that treating it by means of natural therapies, particularly herbal medicines and homeopathic remedies, it responds excellently. And in the paper that I presented, what we did, first of all, I've been treating Epstein-Barr virus for a number of years now, and it's always been something that's been gratifying to treat because typically the person with chronic fatigue syndrome ends up going to many, many physicians over a period of years. Mm-hmm. And many times they're told that their problem is purely psychological, they're put on Valium or something else. Yes. And it's very difficult for many of these people to even be received or for them to be believed that there really is a serious problem. And the problem is that most of the usual indices of disease are absent with chronic fatigue syndrome. The people appear to be well, the blood studies are usually within normal limits, and there's really nothing that indicates a real chronic disease process. And the only thing that seems to be a common thread among these people are what's called elevated blood titer levels for Epstein-Barr virus. Now, Epstein-Barr virus is the virus that causes acute infectious mononucleosis. And this is by no means a new disease. There have been, I mean, since we were kids, it's called the kissing disease.
Yes, yes.
And typically when someone has mononucleosis, they feel under the weather for anywhere from a couple of weeks to a couple of months, 3 months at the most. And there's no known medical treatment for Epstein-Barr virus or for mononucleosis. So their physicians recommend bed rest, and usually within a short period of time the person recovers fully and is back to work or back about the business of living.
That's with the mono. But
that's with the mononucleosis, that's correct. Yeah. So chronic Epstein-Barr virus or chronic fatigue syndrome is actually like a mononucleosis that just appears to linger and goes on and on and on and on. So there's been several problems particularly for patients with Epstein-Barr virus or patients with chronic fatigue syndrome. Number one, the first problem is arriving at a diagnosis. Mm-hmm. And I would say that up until about a year ago, this was just almost impossible for many, many people. As I said, the typical experience with someone with Epstein-Barr virus was going from physician to physician
for years
and years and years, and being thought of as someone who's out to bleed the system and out to try to collect some unemployment and some benefits that they're not entitled to.
And I think really one of the things that's sad is that when you have somebody who has got a disease, and if you treat them like they're neurotic, that's enough to make them a little neurotic.
Sure, yeah. And also, probably the number one symptom, the symptoms will vary, and they'll vary considerably oftentimes between different people. I'd say that the number one keynote symptom of chronic fatigue syndrome is fatigue, and that probably the second keynote symptom is depression, that many of these people are depressed. They're physiologically exhausted. And I think just the process also of seeking help in the medical community and not being able to really find the help can be very, very frustrating and depressing. I think that a lot of what's being written in the media can further depress people in that nothing is really too hopeful, that what we're being told is that this is a syndrome people are just going to have to learn to live with, and there really isn't any help to be offered. And that's true in that there are no pharmaceutical drugs that effectively treat Epstein-Barr virus or the common cold or very few other viruses, in fact, also. So we really have to go outside of mainstream pharmaceutical medicine to really find a solution to the chronic fatigue syndrome puzzle.
That's one of the reasons I've always enjoyed coming to you, because I never had the correct diseases. I
Right.
never had diseases that responded to traditional treatments real well. So,
Well, it appears that a lot of people today don't.
yeah, so if you're having a problem and you're not really getting the kind of help you want, there are alternatives. So.
Right. Well, one of the there were several things that we sort of set about to prove in the paper that I recently published about Epstein-Barr virus. The first point was that this is a syndrome that can definitely be diagnosed, that in my office we use a computerized piece of equipment called the computerized segment electrograph, and we call it the SEG. And the SEG was developed in Germany by several German physicians and physicists, and has been used for research purposes at the University of Heidelberg's School of Occupational Medicine for a number of years now. And they've done many different types of studies with the segment electrograph. And one of the studies they did was they took about 100 healthy females, and they chose women because of more biological variance among women due to the menstrual cycle. They took 25 healthy women, and they ran a series of 20 segment electrograph studies for each of these women over a period of a year. They did 10 of the studies, I believe, in the wintertime, and then 10 of the studies during the summertime to take into account the seasonal variances. Yes. And what they found in comparing all these studies was a practically insignificant degree of variance in the computerized studies of these women over a period of time, which shows that... What
exactly were they picking up on?
Well, what it monitors essentially is the capacity of the body to regulate itself normally. And essentially what the study showed was that if you ran 20 studies for one person and compared them all with each other, they would look almost identical.
So it'd be like a fingerprint then?
Yeah, it'd be like a fingerprint. So what we discovered, there's different things, different information that can be gleaned from the segment electrograph. Let me just tell you a little bit about how it works so we can understand the physics of what we're measuring. The segment electrograph has a series of measurement electrodes that hook onto the body. There's some electrodes that go right over the eyebrow area on the forehead, and there's some electrodes that go over the cervical spine, right between the 7th cervical vertebrae and the 1st thoracic vertebrae, right around the 4th thoracic vertebrae, the mid-spine area. A couple of electrodes are attached. Some electrodes are hooked around the waist to around the 2nd or 3rd lumbar vertebrae, and then some electrodes are hooked onto the upper thigh area. So what these electrodes do is essentially divide the body up into 8 different quadrants, those quadrants being head left and right, thorax left and right, abdomen left and right, and pelvis left and right. And the way it works is that the electrodes measure the surface electrical conductance on the body. They then introduce, through the electrodes themselves, a very, very low intensity electrical stimulus. It's so low that the subject being measured doesn't even feel anything. It then goes back and remeasures surface electrical conductance. And it goes through this process 5 times. The data is fed into a computer, and it's analyzed, and a computer printout is printed out. Well, we understand actually a great deal about surface conductance and how the body typically responds to electrical stimulus. And I'm going to show you some graphs that illustrate this here in a second. But one of the things that we've determined, and this was based on the work of an Austrian physicist, a Dr. Pissinger, I believe his name is, one of the things that we've been able to determine is that when a healthy organism is stimulated electronically, when the skin is stimulated electronically, what we will find is when we remeasure a slightly higher level of electrical conductance. And then if we stimulate again, we'll see the level go up slightly again. So typically, if we were to compare and stimulate an area in the body 5 different times, we would, in a normal individual, see a pattern of regulation that looks something like this. And John, if I can have you zoom in here. This upper graph here, if you can see that, it looks kind of like a pyramid starting down here in this corner. It then will go up. So in other words, we have a bar graph, and each following measurement is slightly higher than the one.
See the increase.
Right, than the one previously. Now, if we look down here at this second reading down here, we call this regulation rigidity. And this is where there's very, very little response to stimulus on the part of the organism. In fact, if we were to go through and measure, stimulate, and remeasure, we would see almost an identical value as the previous measurement. And this is actually a lack of homeostasis, an inability of the body to respond to stimulus, which is what we are doing, of course, on an ongoing basis. We're continuously adapting to changing stimulus.
So it'd be really like a flat electrocardiogram.
Exactly. I'm going to show you one more little graph here, and this is actually the opposite picture of what we had previously. We call this negative regulation. So in other words, we start up here and have a relatively high value. The next one is lower, the next one is lower, the next one is lower. This indicates an actual total inability of the body to adapt to stimulus. And the studies in Germany indicate that the immune system in these individuals is just really non-functional. So,
so what? They just are becoming increasingly. They're really in worse shape than the flat ones, then.
Yeah, probably. You know what we, John, I'm going to have one more of these I want to show you here in just a second. I'm going to show you what a patient's patterns with chronic Epstein-Barr virus looks like, and this is, I think this is exciting because what we've been able to glean is that even though the laboratory findings are essentially normal, the blood studies are essentially normal for these folks, that so profound is the impact of this disease on human beings that their immune system actually becomes non-functional. And we have checked patients with all kinds of different disease processes, even some AIDS patients, and none of them display the same degree of negative regulation that these folks with this chronic Epstein-Barr virus do. Now, I've got 2 of them here to show you, and if we can just kind of zoom in, I guess that's pretty good there. What we have here is some fairly chaotic regulation patterns, but essentially, if we were to go through and average out all these different 8 quadrants, and it starts with the head left, the head right, the thorax left, the thorax right, the abdomen left, abdomen right, pelvis left, and pelvis right. And one of the things the computer does is compares the first bar graph with the last one in each packet. And it then gives a ratio of the final profile to the initial profile, and we should see a value of about 2.0. In other words, we should see the last, if I reach this, the last little bar graph in each packet should be about twice as high as the first one. Well, what we're seeing here in this regulation pattern is that the final regulation packet is about half the size of the first one.
This is the pattern of the people.
And this is the pattern of the people with what we call chronic fatigue syndrome or Epstein-Barr virus.
Now, we have a very definite mathematical way.
Now, what's interesting is, just one last little illustration we want to make here, John. What's interesting is that this is the same patient 30 days later. And we can even look at the 2 of them, I think, side by side to really see a comparison here. That initially, try to hold these as still as I can. In this initial pattern here, the graphs are tending downward, but then just 30 days later, after initiating a natural program, all of the regulation packages are moving in the direction of positive regulation. And thank you, John. In the study we did, we worked with 35 patients, and all 35 of these patients presented SEG patterns showing a lot of negative regulation in 2 or more quadrants, many of them in 8 different quadrants. And all of these people, upon doing follow-up segment electrographs a short time later, showed completely normal regulation packages. So we've been able to substantiate, number one, that chronic Epstein-Barr virus exists, that this thing has profound impact, if not on the chemistry of the body, then certainly on the physics of the body. And secondly, that there is hope that this syndrome can be treated, and that when we do the follow-up studies substantiate the viability of the natural approach.
What I want to do is we need to take a break, and then we want to talk about what exactly would a natural program include.
Okay.
So you all stay tuned, and we'll be back with just a little bit. Welcome back. This is your Health Enhancement Show, and Senator Anderson and I are having a very interesting time talking about chronic fatigue syndrome, which is Epstein-Barr, which is what we've been talking about. The thing that's been very interesting is that you really, while conventional medicine really has had problems diagnosing and also really being clear as to whether there really is something present that's caused by the Epstein-Barr virus, you demonstrated with your graphs very clearly that the person with the Epstein-Barr's immune system is just either, would you say, totally overloaded or just not responding at all. It's just almost shut down.
That's what I'd say.
Yeah.
Very well said.
Yeah. So once you've decided somebody has Epstein-Barr, let's say there's somebody listening to us now and they've been tired and laying around on like a couch potato for 3 or 4 months now, and everybody's thinking, wonder why they don't get up and start moving, and they really just are too tired to kind of lift their finger. If they came to see you, what sort of treatment program would they experience?
Well, the first thing we do, Hilda, is run on a new patient. We run a computerized segment electrograph study on every new person that we see, and I think based on the printouts, we can glean some real understanding of, number one, if they have what we call chronic fatigue syndrome.
Because there is a very, very discernible pattern there.
There definitely is. And in some individuals, we'll see that pattern of negative regulation in all 8 quadrants of the body. And those are the people that I think that have really had the problem for years and that are really debilitated. In other folks, we might see it in one particular area, like in the pelvis. It'll vary in its severity. It'll vary, I think, according to how long someone's had it. But one of the things that I'd like to talk about is that in the paper that we wrote, there were 35 patients that I saw over a period of time that all presented these patterns of negative regulation and that we feel had the chronic fatigue syndrome, and that of the 35 patients, 34 of them had certain electromagnetic fields of disturbance from their environment affecting them. This is things that we've talked about on previous shows that we call geopathic disturbances. And so we can then, I think, based on that information, really glean some understanding about the etiology of chronic fatigue syndrome. And what I believe happens is that many people pick up mononucleosis at some particular point in their lives. And most people, as we mentioned earlier, with mononucleosis, the prognosis is good. They feel weak and tired for a period of time and then basically recover and go about the business of life. And so I believe that they then have the virus dormant within their bodies, and once they get into an electromagnetically disturbed environment, that over a period of time this environment then reactivates this viral syndrome in their body. And we're discovering that more and more about viruses. About 3 years ago, information was released about many polio victims who, they thought that their polio had been in remission for 15, 20 years, were experiencing a reactivation of this viral disease process in their body. So I think that viruses have that capacity, and I'm very, very fascinated with the correlation between electromagnetic phenomena and the occurrence of Epstein-Barr virus. Of the 35 patients, 34 were also being disturbed electromagnetically, and there was one patient who we saw in the study who was not electromagnetically disturbed, and we actually feel, she was a young girl, around 19 years old, we feel that in retrospect that she had acute infectious mononucleosis rather than chronic Epstein-Barr syndrome or chronic fatigue syndrome.
How would somebody know if they had some sort of geopathic distress, or if their geography was stressing out their system?
Well, what it means, first of all, is that basically it all sounds very esoteric and everything, but what it really means is that we are living in a very, very different electromagnetic environment today than has ever existed in the planet previously. It's a very different world today, particularly electromagnetically, than it was even 20 years ago.
You're talking about the fact that we have transformers next to our houses, and we have electrical appliances that are going full blast.
Yeah, precisely. That about 10 years ago, Reader's Digest coined the term electrical smog, and that we know that those of us who live in urban areas are being affected to some extent by microwave transmissions and many of these things that are part and parcel of modern life. Research now indicates that when we are most affected, most adversely affected by these things, is when we're sleeping at night. That during the time we're sleeping, we're actually parasympathetic dominant. We're recharging our batteries during that period of time. And if someone is sleeping with an electric blanket on frequently, if someone's sleeping with a lot of electrical appliances in close proximity to the sleeping area, or if someone has the misfortune of sleeping over some kind of geological fault or underground water, which is what we oftentimes run into here in Georgia, then over a period of time they would begin to experience usually fatigue, and it's fatigue that gradually comes on. And most people with these problems experience fatigue in the morning when they get up, even after having slept 8 hours of seemingly uninterrupted sleep. There's a tendency to wake up feeling fatigued in the morning, and oftentimes that fatigue carries through the day, and they experience that fatigue through the day. So
that's kind of abnormal fatigue then.
Yeah, it's a real chronic kind of fatigue that I believe, in the case of chronic fatigue syndrome, I believe that probably as many as 1 in 3 people out there listening in the television audience are disturbed in some way electromagnetically. That it's
That's
having
what you're
some
saying in your practice.
About that. In my practice, I'm seeing a higher percentage than that because I'm seeing the people who are actually seeking help for different types of chronic problems. But I believe that if we were to do a study of just random sampling of people, random testing of people, we'd find that about 1 in 3 people, which interestingly enough is about the statistics of people with cancer. It was revised about 10 or 15 years ago, maybe 5 years ago. Previously, they had told us that 1 in 4 people would have some form of cancer during their lives, and we're now told that 1 in 3 people will have cancer, and that's progress. That's what all those billions of dollars have done for us.
Yeah.
Got to get that little plug in.
So, well, I think what would somebody do if they're living in a, how would, if you suspect that you might have some sort, or you know you've got lots of electrical appliances?
Well, there's certain things that people can do. Yeah, it's the kinds of things that are real easy to just become aware of and to shelter ourselves from are electric gadgets on the bedside table where we're sleeping. Even just digital clock radios or a digital clock too close to the head area where we're sleeping can create a disturbance field. And the problem is that when we go to sleep, we like to resonate in harmony with what's called the Schumann oscillation field. It's the magnetic field of the Earth, which is about 7.83 hertz. And our house current is on 60 cycles a second. So if we're sleeping, for example, with an electric blanket on at night, we've got a 60 cycle frequency around our body rather than a 7.83 frequency around our body. Or if we're sleeping on a waterbed with an electric heater, that can be a problem. Or people who use electric heating pads at night and sleep with them on all night.
The down jackets would be a great deal.
The down comforters are really terrific. So those are the common things. Also, sleeping with these these little battery-powered quartz wristwatches. Even, what is it, 1.5 volts. It's a very, very small amount of electricity in them, but that pattern that they set up can be disturbing to us if we sleep with them on. So don't sleep with your wristwatches on.
Which is a very simple thing to do.
Yeah, don't sleep with electric blankets. They're doing studies at Duke University about electric blankets, and they're finding an increased incidence of stillbirths among women who sleep with electric blankets. Recently in New York State, there was a bunch of furor that the farmers didn't want the power companies to run these high tension lines through their property to bring the cheap power into New York City. So they got a court order and made the power companies do a $5 million scientific studies about the effects of electromagnetic energies. And they came to a rather startling conclusion. They came to the conclusion that electromagnetic energies can and do cause cancer, and that the researchers felt that they can even predict where children with leukemia will live in an urban area in relationship to where the high tension power lines go. So we're finding that not only the intensity of these electrical fields, but also the frequencies of these fields can be a disturbing factor. So what that means practically is that if you're living in a house where you have these great big tall high tension lines crossing overhead or in very close proximity to your home, you are at risk, according to this study, of developing some kind of chronic degenerative disease. Also, if you have these electrical appliances in too close proximity to yourself when sleeping at night, then this is also a factor that can create some problems.
Well, actually, we're just about out of time, and we haven't begun to hardly scratch the surface. We need to continue with this sometime, but if somebody came to see, you could tell them if they were being subjected to the geopathic stresses, and you could also propose some very nice herbal or homeopathic remedies that are very specific for the Epstein-Barr virus.
Yes, that's correct, and I just would like to suggest that if people have been diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome or suspect that they may have it, that there is hope, that it's not something that needs to debilitate you for the rest of your life.
Yes, and that's why I wanted you to come tell people. So, and I thank you for doing that.
It's a pleasure.
And I thank you all for being with us and invite you to stay tuned. We'll be having a most interesting guest next week who'll be talking about his trip to Sri Lanka, and we'll be talking about acupuncture and affirmations and who knows what else. So stay tuned. Bye-bye.